Good evening. My name is Phương Huang, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Firm for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and the enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly toward that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents to learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Firm, Dickinson College, Information and Technology Services, the Quantitative Reasoning Center, the Women's Gender and Resource Center, the Department of Data Analytics, Geosciences, International Business and Management, Mathematics and Computer Science, Psychology, Physics and Astronomy, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, Glass Walls, a Fireside Chat with author Amy Diehl and Jill Forrester. As a STEM major, thank you. As a STEM major, I noticed how all my science classes have an overwhelming male to female ratio. I remember during the first day of computer science 130, there were only 5 female students in a 25-student class size. I could already feel the existence of an invisible glass wall. As the course progressed, I realized how male students were more confident, outspoken, and adaptive. I had never spoken in the class because every time as I was slightly raising my hand in self-doubt, another male student would raise his hand and say the answer out loud. That was until one class, my professor saw me once again slightly raising my hand and called on me. I spoke in class for the first time, and I got it right. After the class, my professor encouraged me with such inspiring words that I became determined to break the glass wall. I realized I was participating more and more in class, and so today I'm very proud to declare that I'm a data analytics and quantitative economics major, and the wall is officially behind me. Therefore, I am delighted to introduce to you our guests tonight, Amy Diehl and Jill Forrester. Amy Diehl is a well-known leader in information technology and a researcher of gender equity. She's currently serving as Chief Information Officer at Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Prior to this, she served as Associate Vice President and Chief Information Technology Officer at Shippensburg University. Diehl has been featured in many publications, such as Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Ms. Magazine. She's received many awards, including EdTech Dean's List of Higher Ed IT Influencers Worth a Follow in 2020, Central Penn Business Journal Women of Influence in 2019, and the Women in Leadership Affinity Group Outstanding Scholarship for Emerging Scholars Award from the International Leadership Association in 2016. Jill Forrester is currently the Chief Information Officer and Vice President of Information and Technology Services at Dickinson. Forrester has worked at Dickinson since 2002 in roles ranging from Associate Director in Admission to Associate Vice President for Information Services and Director of Enterprise Systems. Her responsibility includes all areas of information technology services, such as academic technology, enterprise system, user services, and infrastructure system. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Firm welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. There will be a book sale and signing in the lobby immediately following the event. At this time, I ask you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that all accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming Amy Diehl and Jill Forrester.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the eclipse this afternoon. It's such an eventful day. So we had the eclipse, which was amazing. The clouds parted, then decided to come together right at totality, but that's okay. It still was spectacular. And then we have this amazing event with Amy. And then to end the day, of course, there is the men's basketball championship. So it's pretty epic for a Monday, in my opinion. So we are here today to discuss some of the writings that co-authors, Dr. Amy Diehl and Dr. Leanne Zubinski, wrote in Glass Walls, Shattering the 6 Gender Bias Barriers Still Holding Women Back at Work. Today, we're going to discuss what I would consider some ugly truths. And you may be tempted to think, this cannot be happening in 2024. It is important to realize that your lived experiences are different from others, and others may be facing these biases today. But don't fear. Well, we'll talk about some ugly truths. We'll then discuss some very practical solutions to address gender biases as an individual, as an ally, and as a leader. Amy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, we are so glad that you're here. You and I share similar leadership positions at our respective institutions. We are chief information officers, me at Dickinson and you at Wilson College. And while we could spend the evening discussing the challenges and opportunities of technology like cybersecurity or artificial intelligence, we are instead tonight going to discuss gender biases women still face at work, and more importantly, how women can overcome them. In addition, we will discuss why it's important for organizations to address gender biases and how they can do so. Women, like us, are in traditional male-dominated fields. And as such, we've experienced many combinations of these biases. Often it's not something you experience just one at a time. I'm excited to have you here and to share what you've encountered and learned through your work experiences and also as you wrote this book. So to start, tell us how you came to work in IT first and then how that led to writing and researching this book.
Yeah, so I'm going to start from what I consider the beginning, and that was 7th grade. Actually, when I was in elementary school, I always loved math. When I got to 7th grade, I had a female math teacher. And she said something one day. She said, if you like math, you should think about becoming a computer programmer. Okay, that sounds good to me. She also said that computer programming was a field that was in demand and made good salaries. So I never had a thought of any other major but computer science as I was working my way through high school. And I went to Shippensburg University and I studied computer science. This was I hate to date myself, but it was the 90s. And it was actually the point of time where women's participation in computer science had been increasing for many years, and it got up to over 30% in the late 80s, early 90s. And I kind of came in at the peak, or whenever the peak was just starting to go back down. Now, women in computer science programs are about 17, 18%, at least the most recent numbers that I've seen. But at the time, I was one of only, usually there was maybe two of us, two women in our classes. And I didn't actually perceive any barriers related to my gender. I got all A's, I did the work, I got the grade, I graduated at age 20, and then I went into the world of work. And I was very fortunate in that I had an internship and then my first job, I had two different female managers who were female software engineering managers. And I was very fortunate in that I could, therefore, because I saw them, they were about 10 to 15 years older than me, I thought I could do that. I could do that job. I could be a manager. So it gave me just that, the role model that I needed to see that I could be a leader. And again, I never thought about gender at that time. But as I started working, then I transitioned from for-profit employment to working in higher education. And my immediate department was mostly men. I had male bosses, and I had wonderful bosses. But I started to notice that I was being treated differently than they were. And in particular, that I started to notice this as I started to work my way up in the hierarchy. And I had one example that always is very clear in my mind. It's one of those things that's just like any other day. I was running a meeting. I had taken over the leadership of a team that my male boss had formerly led. And for years, I had watched him lead the team, and we'd have like an hour-long discussion about some topic, and we'd have different options we could choose from maybe to solve our problem or direction to go. And I would see him make a decision and announce it if we couldn't come to consensus. So he would say, we would talk about something, and he would say, okay, we're gonna go in this direction. And the team would follow along, and everything would be great. Well, shortly after I took over the team, I tried that same approach. There was a meeting, we couldn't come to consensus. I said, okay, we're going to take option B, or whatever it was. I can't even remember what we were talking about, but I remember the outcome, right? So I said, we're going to go in this direction. Well, I got pushback from my team members, from my colleagues. What are you doing? Like this this doesn't make sense to me. Like, it was really interesting, because I'm like, why? They would just follow along whenever he said it. Why are they, giving me resistance? And that was kind of the first clue that I'm like, maybe there is something, going on with gender, but with my gender. But I really started to study it then, because I started to notice other things. So I started to study it when I entered a Ph.D. program in 2009. And I had the ability in that program to, when I had to write papers, I could pick any topic I wanted. So I picked gender barriers, and I started researching what was out there in the literature. What gender barriers were other women who were in leadership were they facing? And the first thing I found out very quickly was that I was not alone. I was not unique in my experiences. And so that was just one example of something very subtle. I had other things that had happened that I took personally, and I thought maybe I'm doing it wrong, maybe I'm at fault. But when I started really getting into the research, I realized, hey, it's not me. This is something that's more systemic. So I did this research in my PhD program. I wrote a dissertation on adversity that women and leaders in higher education had experienced. And I talked to them about what gender barriers they had experienced in their professional lives. I wrote the dissertation. A year later, this was 2014, 10 years ago, I went off to a conference in Utah. And that's where I met my co-author, Dr. Leanne Dubinsky, my now co-author. She had just finished her PhD also, and she had studied women in faith-based nonprofits, and she had studied the challenges that they experienced. And it was really interesting because we were at this conference. It was a two-day conference, and we had the opportunity to share a ride back to the airport on the final day. And we had about 2 hours in the airport. We were a little bit early for the flight, so we just sat there and talked about our respective research. And she would say, well, my women participants experienced this. Well, so did mine. And I would say, my women participants experienced it. Well, so did mine. We started to realize that it really maybe didn't matter what sector or what industry the women worked in. Maybe what mattered was the fact that they were a woman in leadership. And so that's what drove us then to say, we started to combine our sets of research. We published scholarly journal articles, book chapters, and then 6 years ago, we started working on this book because we wanted to get our research and our work out there to a wider audience because we knew that it could help so many people in the practical sense.
Mm-hmm. And I will definitely say, as I read the book, that was something that I took away, was how accessible and practical the information in the book is. So speaking of the book,
Yes.
let's dive in. I have a copy right here, which my son asked if I was going to get it signed, and I was like, yes. So what kind of research went into writing this book, and what was you talked a little bit about this, but what was your goal?
Yeah, so the goal that Leanne and I, Dr. Dubinsky and I had talked about early on was we wanted to understand this concept of gender bias comprehensively. There was lots of things that were written about gender bias, but we would find that we'd read an article would talk about these two barriers. This other article would talk about these two barriers. It was all kind of fragmented, and so we wanted to bring it together. We wanted to fully understand this concept of gender bias and what made it up. How did it work? So what we did was, again, we put our research together, but we decided at a certain point, around 2016, we decided we wanted to build a scale to measure gender bias. And we teamed up with two other researchers, Dr. Amber Stevenson and Dr. David Wong, and we built this scale. And this scale is called the Gender Bias Scale for Women Leaders. But it was out of that scale development that we were able to surface the 6 core factors, the 6 primary factors of gender bias. So I always say that we didn't just pick these 6 factors out of the air. We didn't just pick our 6 favorite ones. These were surfaced in a very scientific way. We take this concept, it seems like a nebulous concept, but it can be broken down into components. And so we surfaced the 6, and as part of that, the scale development, we had some open-ended survey questions that we had our women respondents answer. And so we had a set of data from the open-ended questions about experiences that the women had had. And then what we did was Dr. Dubinsky and I took the 6 barriers and we did more research. And the research that we did next was to find stories, women's stories that were posted in public forums. So like social media posts, like blog posts, published articles. We gathered those stories. That took a little bit of time to gather all the stories. And as I would come across things, I would save them to a folder so I could go back and reference them later. We took all the sets of data that we had, which was like our dissertation interview data, this survey data, and then these public stories, and that became the foundation of the book that filled in each chapter of the 6 barriers.
Excellent. So we're talking about 6 barriers, and I feel like I'll channel Scott Lamar a little bit from our interview last week, but we don't want to bury the lead, and I know you all are interested to learn what are the 6 barriers, what's holding us back. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about the first one that you identify, which is male privilege. So do you want to talk a little bit about male privilege and how women experience that in the workforce?
Yeah. So male privilege is men's inherent advantage caused by workplace cultures in which men are the leaders, they control the resources, they set the standards, and they assign women to a second-class status. And I have a couple examples. So in each chapter of the book, if you read it, there's lots of examples and there's lots of sub barriers, I'll call them. So some of the sub barriers that fit under male privilege, one is called male gatekeeping. Male gatekeeping occurs when men choose which women are allowed into leadership and set the bounds of their authority. So it's not that women aren't allowed to become leaders. It's just that often when there's male gatekeeping involved, what happens is that the men are choosing those token women to fill maybe 1 role, maybe 2 roles, maybe 2 spots if we're lucky. But it tends to be the women who are deemed to be supportive of the patriarchal culture, or will support the men's privilege. Another example is a boys' club culture. It's where informal culture revolves around men's interests. I have an example of this. It happened to me just maybe 2 weeks ago. I received an email from a software vendor. And the email was about a Phillies webinar. And it was about, if you come to this webinar, we're going to do Philadelphia Phillies trivia, and we are going to give you also tickets to opening day. Well, that's great and all. There's nothing wrong with sports, but there's this idea that everybody loves sports and that everybody is conversant about sports, which is just not the case. And so the funny thing about this particular email is from this vendor is that the vendor was selling human resources software. If you know anything about human resources, it is actually very female dominated. 76% of human resource workers and 76% of human resource managers are women, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's kind of ironic that they were trying to entice, people to, to come to a webinar to learn about their software about, an interest, something about sports, which tends to be, again, have more male interest than female interest. So that's an example of a boys' club. It's an assumption. It's just assumptions that everybody is into the things that are typically thought of as male interest. And then the last example of male privilege is something called role incredulity. It's where women are assumed to be not in charge, or they're assumed to be in support roles or in traditional female roles. It's like, for example, when a medical doctor is assumed to be a nurse, or when a female professor is assumed to be the administrative assistant. Nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of these roles. They're all very important and very vital to our organizations. The problem is the assumption that it's only men that are filling the roles of people who are in charge or who are the leaders.
Yeah, and you give a great example of that in a book where a pharmacologist is speaking with a customer that has called in, and the customer keeps insisting, well, I need to talk to the person who can give me the medication. And who is that? It's me. Dr. Me? and this continues, this conversation, until finally the woman has to say, no, I am actually the person who will administer the medication. And I think that's a great example of that.
Yeah, it was interesting because the point that she was making is that the person on the other end, before they would believe that she was the prescriber, they thought that her name was Dr. Me, Dr. Emmy. Like they would believe that before they would believe that, that she had the authority to prescribe the prescription.
Yes. Okay, so what about, let's move on to the second barrier that we see, which is disproportionate constraints.
Yeah. So disproportionate constraints, this is when women are constrained to act in ways that are supportive of men and when they're held to unequal standards compared to men. I'm sure maybe you've all heard that women often feel that they have to do twice as much and be twice as good to get the same level of respect or the same promotions as men. That would be an example of unequal standards. Other examples are what we call in the book muting women's voices. That's constraining how women speak and who gets credit when they speak. And the example that I talked about earlier, my own example, where when I led in a way that was authoritative, that wasn't accepted from me the same way it was in my male supervisor. That's an example of women's voices and the constraints around them. Another sub-barrier in this category is scrutiny. It's when women are subjected to criticism that men are not, such as criticism of their appearance, their voice, their clothing, or even just a hyper vigilance on their performance, their actual work performance.
And what about labeling? Can you talk a little bit about labeling? I think that's something that probably we've all heard. It's been talked about, right? So labeling is, of course, when we might describe a woman's behavior as bossy, or she's being dramatic, right? And how that can cause these disproportionate constraints.
Yeah, that's a way of constraining women, trying to shut them down. She's bossy, she's a bitch, that's another one. It's all these labels that you never hear said about men. Even things like she's too assertive. Like, what man is too assertive? If she's too ambitious, she's too this, she's too that. But yet these same labels, when you apply them to men, are generally viewed as a good thing. So it's just another way of trying to keep women in their supposed place.
Yep. And I thought emotional labor was another interesting one that I hadn't necessarily thought about, but I know I've experienced that in my own career, and that is women are often thought of as caretakers, people who will listen, and as a result, we often have to carry some emotional burdens where we might have coworkers come in and talk to us about extremely personal things, and that is a lot of emotional labor that we carry in addition to having to do our 9-to-5 jobs.
Yep, and sometimes, some of the examples in my book were women who would have to sit and listen to their bosses talk about their personal issues. So when it's your coworker, okay, maybe you're in a mutually supportive situation, I hope. But when it's your boss, and it's not a mutual thing, it's just I'll say him, it's him or her, usually him, coming to you and, complaining about or, venting about his problems, when really they should maybe be talking to a therapist or a counselor, right? And not wasting work time, you're not spending the work time on, the personal issue. The woman in that scenario really has no choice. It's her boss.
Yep.
What can she say to say, oh, this really isn't appropriate? She might be able to say that depending on the nature of the relationship, but she might run into trouble,
Yep.
Because
and we'll talk about some strategies, how to back out of that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on to number 3, which is insufficient support.
Insufficient support. So this is women's lack of access to social structures and networks that would help them advance. So kind of the example that we've maybe all heard of is women's lack of mentoring. Women tend to be mentored less formally and informally than men. The lack of sponsoring. Sponsoring is when somebody who is in a position to do so will advocate for your advancement or promotion. Another example is being excluded from informal networks. And the exclusion actually goes a couple different ways. It can be you're just not invited. If the culture is that your work colleagues go out for drinks after work. Maybe you're not invited. That often happens. But sometimes it's that you are invited, but you can't because you've got maybe caretaking duties. Or maybe you just don't want to. Maybe you want to go spend your time after work doing something else. Well, the problem isn't necessarily even that these social events are happening. The problem is when work stuff, when work items are discussed and decisions are made in these informal settings. I know we'll go more to solutions, but the solution for that one is if you're in the midst of that conversation at the bar or on the golf course, stop the conversation and say, hey, let's talk about this on Monday at work, and let's include Amy and Jill to make sure that everybody who's in the room is there. So that's another example. And then another one we talk about in the book is unsupportive leadership, and that's when women are harassed or discriminated against, and their own leadership will not support them.
Mm-hmm. And I think another common one, and this certainly has come up in our country as we have discourse, is communal resources. So there we're talking about access to childcare, access to parental leave. I was very proud when Dickinson moved from having a leave policy that was a maternity leave policy to one of paternity leave policy where both partners could take advantage of that. But as we know, access to affordable childcare is actually a huge barrier to women joining the workforce, women progressing in their careers in the workforce, because often, and as we talked earlier, many of these barriers, they come from societal norms, and a societal norm often is the woman is the primary caretaker. And I think it's important for us to face that and to realize that if we really do want to support women as they work and build a professional career, or as they work to support their family, that we consider how might we provide affordable childcare to families.
Yes. And also, it's a two-parent family. There's also the single-parent family, and women who don't have even the choice of staying home. They have to work, and so the affordable childcare is something that really needs to be addressed at the federal level. To make it affordable and accessible to everyone, so that we can have a vibrant and thriving economy.
Absolutely.
Everybody participating.
Yes. We could go on for quite some time discussing insufficient support. But we'll move on to the next light topic of devaluation and how women are devalued in the workforce.
Yeah, so devaluation are attempts to make women seem unimportant and detract from their authority. So one example is something called office housework. Has anybody heard of this term office housework before? A few of you have, yeah. So office housework is when women, I wouldn't say office housework is all those tasks that are important to keep an organization running, but they are generally non-promotable. They are generally not rewarded, oftentimes they're not even acknowledged. So it's jobs like taking notes in a meeting, organizing the office party, or just even sometimes just helping a colleague with a project. And again, there's nothing wrong with these jobs. They're very important. They're just very rarely rewarded, and sometimes not even acknowledged. And often women will often experience backlash if they say no or that they don't volunteer. And I was just I'm on social media all the time, but one of my social media comments just in the last couple of days was about someone who said that she was complimented for like what a great party planner she was, or how pretty her handwriting was. So the women will be given these compliments to guilt them into taking up the office housework when it's really something that's important. It's important for everyone to share it. We could go into solutions for that, but it's something that shouldn't just fall on the women. Another example of devaluation is one that I'm sure you're all aware of. It's salary inequality, where women are paid less than men for the same type of work. Women are paid less at all ages, all races and ethnicities. Women make less than white men. And then even when you compare salaries by position, there are very few positions in which women make more than men. And there's some of the most prevalent positions in our economy, like K through 12 teachers and nurses, for example. There are less men in those fields, right? Men are by and far, those fields are predominantly women. But the men who are in those fields are making more than the women are. So that's an example of how the women's work is devalued through the monetary reward that they're given.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that is certainly something that has garnered a lot of discussion, worthwhile discussion, but progress definitely still needs to be made there. I think also, this idea of devaluation comes in, sometimes it's benevolent sexism. It's, a man thinking, well, I'm protecting her from having to do this. I'll do it for her. When that's really devaluing. She is able to do that herself. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that one too, sometimes you'll see women being denied opportunities, especially younger women, or a woman who maybe has just had a child. Oh, she just had a child, so she probably won't want to travel, or she probably won't be able to do this, without even asking the woman, giving the woman the choice, right? So that's another way that benevolent sexism takes effect, where it's this thought of we're protecting women. When women don't need that type of protection, they can make their own choices, and they just need to be given the opportunity and the ability to decide for themselves.
It's so important not to assume that somebody doesn't want to travel, for example, right? Always better to ask them and have that conversation.
Or somebody doesn't want that next promotion because maybe they have a small child or something.
Right. Yep. Pet names is another way. So that's obviously very overt, right? But this idea of, hey, Missy, and we see that often in a lot of service industries. I think that can happen where customers, hey, little lady, come over here and get this, right? And that's really devaluing the work that individual is doing.
But it's interesting that it's not just in the service industry. I mean, it's bad that it's there, but it's also in, the other office type jobs. And I just was telling some folks about this today. About a month ago, a vendor, an older man, he called me a young lady. Okay, I think he was trying to give me a compliment, say that I looked young, but would he have called my male counterpart young man? It was the same, no. So why is this even being brought up? It was a discussion about a construction project, and I had some other coworkers there, but why was it even brought, why did he even need to say it? He didn't.
Yeah, I thought it was, as I was reading that chapter, a quote stuck out to me, and that is, that when we devalue women, we're communicating to women that they don't belong in the workplace, but they do belong at home. And a lot of that devaluation, that's exactly what it says.
Yeah, the pet names, if you think about a lot of those pet names, they're perfectly acceptable in the home. You might call your significant other sweetie or honey, but why are they being used in the workplace in a professional setting? They just don't belong.
They shouldn't be. Okay, so let's move on to hostility.
Yeah, hostility is an active resistance to women's presence in the workplace. Hostility tends to be more overt, although sometimes it can still be subtle. But it's things like discrimination, harassment, retaliation. And the goal of hostility is to keep women in their supposed place, again, under men in the gender hierarchy. Hostility also includes female hostility, and I'm often asked this question, or the question will often come up, it's not just the men that were hostile towards me, it was the women. Why is that? Female hostility happens when women do not support each other, or they actively block opportunities or sometimes even harass. And one thing I'll say before I go into this a little bit further is that if there's been studies that have shown that most women, quantity-wise, are supportive of other women. But whenever we experience hostility from another woman, we tend to remember it. It tends to hurt more. We tend to be more surprised by it because we expect solidarity from our fellow women, right? But the reason that this happens is because the women are often made to feel insecure. And especially women who have risen to top positions, they may have the very real perception that their perch will be threatened if they help another woman. Like if it's very clear that there's only one woman and a leadership team at the top, they might know that if they help another woman, she might threaten that one spot that's there for the others. So it's a consequence, it's a symptom of the gender discrimination, and just a reminder that we've all been socialized into the same system, men and women, people of all genders. So that's why that can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and under hostility are a lot of very common things that I think all of us should be aware of. You know, we are talking about discrimination, hiring, promoting, firing based on gender. While these things are illegal, it does not mean they don't happen. And when we get to solutions, you know, certainly, and the book does an excellent job as each of these barriers are presented of then highlighting how, in perhaps different roles that you have, how you can overcome these barriers and even to, you know, reporting discrimination. But what happens if you report and nothing is done, which certainly can happen. I think too, retaliation is another form of hostility, which again can be both from a male or a female retaliating. So reporting something and then there's retaliation against you, which then is going to hurt your career or perhaps have you actually move out of that organization because it just becomes unbearable.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I was talking about this under insufficient support, but we see far too often where the person who reports discrimination or reports harassment or reports retaliation is the person that's told to stay home while the investigation happens, or is the person who's let go from their job. Meanwhile, the potential perpetrator is still there and still earning their salary, or well, they're maybe both earning their salary while the investigation is going on, but they're still retaining their job. It's like to try to keep, the goal of this is to try to keep women quiet so that, you know, you don't make waves and, you know, again, keep you in your place is the idea there.
Yeah. I do want to circle back around to this idea of female hostility and why it can happen because we've been talking a lot about, well, males doing this, which is creating a barrier. But as you said, it can be female hostility as well. And it's this idea, either queen bee or mean girl. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we divided female hostility into two different types, queen bee behavior and mean girl behavior. And by the way, I'm very careful to use the term behavior. I don't like to call people queen bees or mean girls. But I do like that there's a illustrative label, you know, for the type of behavior. So queen bee behavior happens when a woman at the top fails to help other women below her or actively prevents their promotion or advancement or actively harasses that person. The mean girl behavior happens between women who are peers, when one woman, becomes an impediment to another woman, or sometimes it can happen from lower level women in the hierarchy towards women who are at upper level or in different positions. An example of that would be like a nurse towards a female doctor, which unfortunately, you would not believe, like this happens all the time, where the nurses will give the male doctors everything that they ask for immediately, but then the female doctor asks and they're like stonewalled. And which is very scary if you think about it, because if I'm being operated on, I want everybody to be operating with their best intentions and not, not delaying or not, making life difficult for the surgeon. And then another example of that would be like an administrative assistant towards, let's say, a professor or somebody or a manager. So.
Yeah, you gave a great example in the book too, that Katie Couric admitted to queen bee behavior during her career, where she had risen up in journalism, was well known, well established. And as such, she had opportunity to really help elevate other women in the industry and move them along. And she readily admits that, she would elevate women in fields that didn't directly compete with hers. And that was insecurity. And it was, she said, I behaved in that way because I knew there were so few spots that I didn't want a woman that was younger to take my spot or become competition. And I think that really does illustrate, for those of us who are in leadership positions, that we really need to guard against this kind of behavior, because you may not even realize that it's happening. And so, part of being in a leadership position is really cultivating and elevating, especially I think in my field, our field, and in our positions, cultivating women in the profession, so that, for our student over there who joined a computer science class that only had 5 women in it, that, we're making progress and we begin to see more and more women in fields that are traditionally male dominated.
Yeah, that's right. And kudos to Katie Couric for admitting that.
Yeah.
I think that it's something for all of us to reflect on. Those of us who are leaders, have I ever had those thoughts? Because again, we're all socialized into the same system. We've all grown up with the same stereotypes. And like Jill said, it's more about the fact that Katie knew that there were only so many spots for top women at the top of the journalism, the TV journalism game. And she was the anchor, of the nightly news, and she knew that, if she fell, that someone else would be younger, prettier, would be there to take her place. But kudos to her for admitting it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
About it.
Okay, well, let's move on. I think we're on number 6 here, which is acquiescence. And I have to admit that I definitely have seen this in my own life. You want to introduce this barrier?
Yeah. So due to the combined weight of all the other barriers, women internalize the obstacles, accept them as valid, and adapt to the limitations. And I have a couple examples, again, for acquiescence. One is work-life conflict. And the reason that this is in acquiescence is because it's often talked about as an issue for women, but not for men. Like, we hear the term often, working mother. She's a working mother. But do we hear the term, he's a working father? Does he have a conflict because he has children? So therefore he won't have time for his job or for that next promotion? No, it's not even, in fact, if men have children, maybe they feel that they're even more, qualified to move up. Another example is self-silencing. That's when women stay silent on women's equality or workplace sexism, even when they're a victim. So they don't speak up about something that's happened to them. And the reason that this happens is because the women may recognize that they will get backlash if they speak up. So they stay silent to stay loyal to the male leaders above them. And to protect themselves. It's a self-protection mechanism. And then my last example is self-limited aspirations. So women may internalize all these other barriers and think they are not qualified for a promotion or another role. Or women may recognize that they are qualified, but they retreat. Because they just don't want to have to deal with all the hassles that men don't face. We've had several women in our research who said, I know I could do this next leadership position, but it's just too much of a hassle. And I have other people who have even told me it wouldn't be worth it. It wouldn't be worth my emotional and mental health because of all these barriers, right? And that's the result, is that women self-choose. It's a very rational choice, by the way, but they choose on their own to stay in their role or not go for that next role, even though they know in their hearts that they could do it.
Yeah, and I know self-limited aspirations was one that definitely hit home to me. I have done this myself. In fact, when I was offered the position of CIO and vice president here at Dickinson, and really had some self-doubt moments. Can I do the job? Should I do the job? I'm not good enough or qualified to do the job, right? And feeling that. And these are real feelings that we have. And I think, we need to have confidence in ourselves. And it's definitely something that you have to fight against. And I think research has shown that men approach promotional opportunities very differently. They don't think, well, I don't have this qualification, this qualification, this qualification. They say, yes, I'll do it, and they just go for it. Yeah. And, I'm generalizing, right? But on a whole, they have shown this, and I think that's where this idea of self-limiting really, and I think that's why that surfaced in the research that you did. I think the other piece, I had read this a couple of years ago, and I found it really interesting and realized I had done this on a job search as well, and that is that when women read job ads, they go through all of the requirements that are listed. So the ones that say, you absolutely must have these things, and then these are preferred, and they go through every single one, and if they see one they don't have, they say, I can't, I'm not qualified, I'm not even going to apply. And then the research showed that men, on the other hand, might only have 3 of them and said, that's it, I'll send my resume in and see where it goes. And so the idea is definitely take the risk and put yourself out there. But I think too, those of us in leadership and those of us who craft these job descriptions need to make sure we are really only putting the requirements that are truly needed, and we're not adding a bunch of extra stuff, because by doing that, we could really be excluding, or women could be self-excluding themselves from a potential wonderful career.
We could go on a whole topic about how job ads are crafted, and how certain language appeals to men more so than women, like work hard, play hard culture. Well, a woman's going to see that and be like, that's not for me. So really, and using terms like teamwork and supportive culture and things like that can be more appealing to a woman.
Yeah. So we've hit the 6, and I promised you that we would have some time for some solutions. I told you we were going to go through some ugly stuff here. So, but hopefully we've done it in a way that you're not too depressed about the walls that we face. But I do want to, before we hit solutions, I think that it's really important to hit on how does gender bias play out for, let's say, women of color and other marginalized groups, that they really live at the intersection of gender and being a member of a marginalized group.
So I want to be clear that in the book we do have lots of examples from women who have multiple of non-privileged, I'll call them, identity factors. And in general, well, this isn't a book about intersectionality. It's a book that focuses on gender. We don't ignore the topic. But to generalize, the more non-privileged identity factors that one has, the worse the experience is going to be. And to give you one example, women of color, for example, told us that they were dealing with something called, all women deal with this thing called credibility deficit, right? And it's a part of devaluation, and it's when women's statements and their credibility just isn't believed, right? So the women of color would say, I always felt like I was pressed that I needed to. Anytime I would go into a room where there were new people, I had to give a synopsis of my resume before I even started to speak, so that I had the chance for my words to be believed, because I would say I did X, Y, and Z, I had X, Y, and Z degrees, and I did X, Y, and Z experiences. Whereas the man walks into that same meeting and he just gets to speak, and he's believed. And so it was things like that where it was, you know, again, the more non-privileged identity factors one had, the harder the experience was. Again, overly generalizing, but that's the synopsis.
Yeah. There definitely is a compounding effect.
Yes.
I think is what you described in the book there. So let's talk about some solutions. What can we do? So what advice would you give leaders for creating equitable and inclusive organizations that can allow everyone to thrive?
Yeah, so as Jill said, in this book, we have every chapter ends with strategies for leaders, allies, and individual women. And then we have a whole chapter 7, that talks about how leaders can create a gender equitable and inclusive culture. But I'm going to give you a few tips. There's certainly much more in the book if you read it.
That's a plug.
Yeah, that's a plug. Yeah. One of the ways is that within your organization, you want to replace competition with collaboration. So you want to make it a collaborative environment where everybody succeeds, and then therefore your organization succeeds. Don't set up your organization so that you've got your people, your employees, fighting against each other, right? You should all be pointing towards the same goal, whatever that goal is of your organization. Another idea is to provide options for remote and flexible work. If a job can be done remotely or it can be done in a hybrid way, let it be done in a hybrid way, or let people work from home whenever that will not impede their getting their job done. That really helps women, especially women that have caretaking responsibilities, to effectively balance their work and their life. And the flexible work, we know that not all jobs are, have the ability for remote work. There are a lot of in-person jobs, but that doesn't mean that there can't be flexibility offered. Trading shifts with other people, allowing people, if they have to run out to go to the doctors for an hour, somebody else covers the phones, for example. There's lots of ways to have flexibility. That would allow people to, not just women, but allow people to live their full lives and still maintain their employment. Another idea is to eliminate overwork. Eliminate this idea of having to be on 24/7. And some of the industries we studied are worse than others. Medicine, of course, it tends to be like this. Law has this expectation, and a lot of law firms have this expectation for 24/7 availability. And it really, really hurts for, again, women that, I always talk about women that have caretaking responsibilities that can't do it, but also others that just want to have a life outside of work. And all of these things are good for men too. Like, none of these things are just beneficial for women, but they will help women keep up and create a more equitable workplace.
I loved that suggestion, and I think that it's one here at Dickinson that we are trying to practice more and more, is this idea of, let's set some boundaries. And I think we have certainly found, email can creep into your life at any point in time, but we have a great new feature in email where we can actually delay the send to the next day. And sometimes I find myself, it's on my mind, I want to take care of it. But I do know, and I do recognize in my position, sending out an email to James in the audience, he may feel he needs to respond after hours, and that might not be what I want to happen. And so delaying that send, and you touch on that in the book, just put it into send in the morning, and then that takes that temptation, if you will, to continue to work, or that feeling that you need to keep working.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when it's like you were saying, the relationship between you and James, you're the supervisor, you're the boss. So if somebody who's working for you that you're sending that email out to, they're going to feel like, I'm compelled to respond. It's my boss, even if the boss doesn't think that or isn't communicating that. But it also sets an expectation that the boss works all these odd hours. Maybe I should be doing that too.
Right.
So that's a very good practice.
All right. Did you have other tips, or
do you want to move on?
I know you have some advice for allies.
Yeah, we can go into allies?
Yeah, that
okay.
sounds great.
So for allies, so any of us can be an ally, no matter your gender. And what is true about allies is that in any situation we can be an ally, right? Whether we are in a leadership position or we're a colleague or we're just a bystander, right? So for allies, the most important thing is to call out bias when you see it. One of the things I talk about in the book, and we give this name, it's called heap eating. So has anybody ever heard the term heap eating?
I love that.
Heap eating is when a woman suggests an idea and it's ignored, and then a man says the same thing and everyone loves it. So that's heap eating. And so what happens in that situation is often the man gets the credit. Well, if you're an ally and you see that happening, let's say you're in a meeting and you say, that Jill just gave this idea, and then James said it, and everybody's looking at James now. Well, if I'm in the meeting, I can say, hey, Jill just said that. Let's hear more about what she has to say about it. So I've called it out in a nice way, and I've given the floor back to Jill so that she can explain the idea and get the credit that she deserves for it. Another good quick tip, and this isn't one in the book, but I'm going to give this anyway. This was one that we wrote about in an article for Fast Company. The article was about the 30 critiques that women get that men almost never hear. But it's this test. It's called the Flip It to Test It test. And this was developed by a sociologist. Her name is Kristen Pressner. She has a TED Talk about it. But basically, what you do is if you're thinking about a criticism or something that might be said of a woman, you flip it and you say, would that same thing be said of a man? Like, if you would say Amy's going to have kids and so she won't want to work after that. Well, would you say the same thing? James is going to have kids and he won't want to work? Probably not. Would you say that you might say Amy's bossy? Would you say that James is bossy? Probably not. So it's a way to I think it's also a good tool if you have to write performance evaluations for staff, is to, write out what you want to, evaluate, what feedback you want to give, but think about if you're evaluating a woman, if I would put her male counterpart in there, would I be writing this in the same way? Would I be giving the same feedback? And so it's a really, really quick, easy method that any of us can use when we're thinking about, is this bias or isn't it?
Yep. What about advice that you would give to women who are experiencing some kind of gender bias?
Yeah, and before I go into this advice, one thing I want to say is that this book, Glass Walls, we wrote the book that Leanne and I wrote the book we wish we had when we were starting out in the workforce. Because when I went into the workforce, I talked about this a little bit, but I had no idea that gender would be a factor. I thought if I worked hard, I would get the same rewards as everyone around me, all the men around me. And of course, I found through trial and error, I found that wasn't the case. But I had, looking back on it, I wished I'd had this kind of as a primer to where I could read and know and get a sense of what I might encounter and how I might handle it. So the first tip for women is to be prepared. So learn about it, learn as much as you can about it. Hopefully most of the things in here don't happen to you, but unfortunately I can guarantee that some of them will, just because we are women in the workforce, and this problem is a very, very hard problem to eradicate completely. So be prepared, learn as much as you can about it. The second tip is do not take it personally. Once you've learned about it, you can see the patterns. When you see it happening, like when the man called me a young lady, I can kind of laugh that off because I see where it's coming from, right? I don't take it personally. If you don't take something personally, it gets the emotion out of it. It can help you come up with a solution in a kind of a rational way, in a thoughtful way, rather than reacting out of emotion. Just realize that the problem isn't you, and the problem isn't unique to you. Another tip is to build your support network. So especially for those of you who are in college, as you're coming out of college, maintain your friendships with your college classmates. And then when you get into the workforce, find other people who are supportive, other coworkers, people at all levels. And you kind of have to feel people out. Not everybody's supportive, and not everybody's going to be your best friend, but feel people out and just build that support network. And know that it's good to have many people in your support network, so you're not relying just on one person. Next tip for women is to take care of yourself. Life is not all about work. Make sure you have friendships, hobbies, take your vacations, spend time with your family. That helps you to have perspective. So when you realize that, yes, this stuff that's happening to me isn't nice, it isn't fun, but it's not my whole life. I have a life outside of work. And then the last tip that I like to give is what to do if you're in a really toxic situation. If you're in a situation where you're encountering barrier after barrier and you've tried to fix it, you know, you've made a good effort, you've talked to people, but you find that you're just not getting support. You're just not getting support. You're not getting help. You're not getting assistance. The tip here is to have alternatives and be willing to use them. So you don't want to let one job or one boss or one workplace be the end-all be-all. Think about what else you could do. You know, could you go to work someplace else? Could you transfer, if you're in a large organization, could you transfer to another department? Could you go back to school and learn a different skill? Could you go work for yourself? So the thing I like to leave folks with is just know that there are many, many jobs and many, many opportunities out there. So don't let one bad job or bad situation block your happiness and success. You can find your own success.
That's a great way to end our conversation. Yes. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
It is now time for the question and answer session. So that everyone in the audience and our speakers can hear your question clearly, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Wallner-Butcher. I'm a WGSS major, but my interest is really, do you think that in our current capitalist system that we can ever truly achieve gender equity?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question, and I appreciate that question. I'll say I don't know. I'll say this because it's a very, very pernicious problem, and it's very, very hard even for one organization to eradicate it at all levels. But I can say this, that we can make progress, and we have been making progress. It's just slow, and often when societal progress is made, you'll see backlash. Like we've seen backlash from Me Too, we've seen other types of backlash. But I also think about societal problems that we have solved, and I mentioned some of these at the very end of the book. Like it used to be that when I was growing up, that you'd walk into a restaurant and it was filled with smoke because people were smoking. Well, now that's like not the norm anywhere, or very, very few places. So smoking in public places has been largely, eradicated. Seatbelts. Again, when I was small, there were no seatbelt laws. I was sitting in the back of my dad's car. There weren't even seatbelts in that car. But now, seatbelts are, they're enforced law. And so change has been slow, societal change is slow and it's hard, but it can be achieved. So I don't know the answer to that question if it would ever be achieved, but all I can say is that my goal and my passion, my goal is to keep working towards it and to make as much improvement as I can in my lifetime, and to leave this better place for for people coming behind me. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming. I'm a computer science major, and especially as we're entering the workforce, you talked a little bit about the salary issue that we might face as women, and I was wondering how does that conversation even start with your coworkers, because especially it's a very stigmatized issue, and if you do realize that your coworkers are making more money than you, then how do you raise that to the company or your boss? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. First of all, before you go into your first of all, I will say that the solutions for this are not at the individual level. Like the real solutions are for society and for organizations to establish equal pay and to continually, one thing you have to do, the organizations have to do is continually monitor for it, because it can sneak in, if you don't have annual audits and things. But, your question is, if you're the person, you got to look out for yourself. Right, so in particular, before going into your first role, you want to do research. Look at what average salaries are, so that and average salaries for the metro area that you're going to be working in, so that you have an idea about what you should be offered. Don't be afraid to negotiate. And I'll give you this example. This was when I was an intern. My previous experience was working at McDonald's, okay, and then I became this intern, and I didn't know how much to ask for, and they didn't know how much to pay me. And I remember I had asked for a certain dollar amount, and I realized that I didn't ask for enough because I was having to I was living in Shippensburg, and I was having to commute up to Camp Hill, and it was only I think they were going to pay me $8 an hour, and I wanted like 10 or something. And I thought, oh, I really screwed this up. Like, I really should be getting. And so I called them back, and I actually asked for more money, and they gave it to me, which was like amazing. So don't be afraid to ask. Women do sometimes get backlash for asking, but I would say if you're at a place where you're getting backlash for that, you need to look other places. So there's that. Do start if your organization doesn't explicitly prohibit discussions about salary, do ask around to your trusted coworkers. Any information that you can get about what your coworkers are making is valuable information. Some organizations, in particular ones that are involved with state government, I'm not sure about the federal government, but state government is often subject to open records laws, so you can actually go out and research how much your coworkers are making. And that is good information to have because it'll help you. And know that if you've got a coworker who's been working for 20 years and you're just coming into the role, of course there's going to be a pay differential there. But so you want to try to look at like for like, somebody who's like newer in the role, and so do your research and don't be afraid to ask. Mm-hmm.
Hi, good talk. I just wanted to ask, what was the turning point, if you had one, for deciding to go into these kinds of studies and look at women in the workforce and how they're discriminated against? Thank you.
Yeah, so I had two turning points. The one I talked about was like me realizing that I was experiencing things in my own workplace. But the other turning point was when I did my dissertation research. I went around and I did face-to-face interviews with 26 women leaders in higher education. They were women presidents, vice presidents, and provosts. And at the time, I was in like a kind of middle management position, so these women were senior to me, and most of them were older. The thing that I learned from these women was that most of them had dealt with significant adversity. Most of them had dealt with many gender barriers that they recognized. But I thought that there was something different about them. Like I thought that I didn't have what they had, especially the presidents, But what I realized in talking to them was that so many of them, not 100%, but so many of them were very insecure. They were very high achieving, they were very hardworking, but they were also very insecure. And they were talking to me about their adversity, and so of course they were sharing a more insecure, vulnerable side of themselves. But the thing that I came away realizing was that these women were just like me. And there was no difference. I was high achieving. I was also insecure at times. So that was a turning point for me, really wanting to then write about this topic, get it published, and then meeting my co-author was the catalyst to help get the research done in a more robust way. So thank you for that question. There's one here.
I thought it was really interesting when you were saying that the first time you experienced really significant gender bias during your beginning of leadership, that you almost didn't recognize it. And I think that's an experience I had a lot the last few years, especially when feedback was coming from people I trusted. I was told by my advisor for my internship that I needed to start thinking about whether or not I was going to have kids or a career at 16. And I was told that when I played field hockey, I was too aggressive and dominant. And when I did speech and debate, I didn't smile enough and I was too dominant. And all of this feedback came from people that I really trusted, and I took it as personal feedback. And it took me years of talking to fellow women who had those experiences to be like, oh, no, that wasn't an okay thing to experience. So do you have any suggestions about ways to identify that, especially when it is like a female peer or someone that you really trust the opinion of, how to identify it and kind of change that opinion so it doesn't become something that's self-actualized, like you were talking about in your latter point?
Yeah, so the answer to that is really just to learn as much as you can about it. And kind of sparking an idea in me, which is that I don't know what's out there for teenagers, but we really need something for teenagers that would be accessible, to them and to speak to their experiences as well, so that they can start, young girls can start identifying it at an even earlier age. But it really is about learning about it and learning as much as you can about how it works and what the patterns are. One of the things we didn't touch on, but we give names to a lot of types of gender biases in this book that we give labels. Dr. Dubinsky and I developed labels for things that didn't exist before. The behavior existed, but there was no term for it. And so we developed these different terms, and which is very helpful in being able to identify the bias and then being able to talk about it. So it's just really the answer is to learn as much as you can, so that once you realize, when you can see the patterns, then you can say, oh, that person was telling me to smile more. That's a sexist thing to say, because men don't get told to smile more, right? And even if it's, sometimes it does come from people that we trust or that want the best for us. But they were all socialized into the same system, so they are coming from their own socialization, which, is a part of the patriarchal culture that we've all been raised in. Good question, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciated how you laid this out systematically. And while it's, even knowing some of this is always hard to hear, especially thinking about how these all work together, right? How queen bees still operate at age 50, and how that's fueled by gatekeeping and tokenization and emotional labor, and so all these systems feed into each other. So I have a twofold question, right? One, I'd love to hear you talk about how these systems work together, and then I'd love to hear you talk about an example of replacing competition over collaboration, because I think one of the ingrown challenges here is that oftentimes the mechanisms to transform institutions will replicate these problems. Like one of the things that you write about is the glass cliff, which I think we've heard a lot about recently, where women, and especially women of color, are drawn into leadership positions oftentimes with the perception that their empathy or their can-do or attitude will fix a problem, and then it's a structural problem, and when they don't succeed, they are just tossed off of it. So I would love to hear if you could talk a little bit more about what are some of those practices about creating an inclusive institution when sometimes the very practices become part of the problem.
Well, to your point, yes, these barriers, they do operate together. We've teased them apart. In chapter 7, we do bring them all together. We call that when barriers combine, because in reality, it's not like we just get one or the other. Sometimes they're all happening in combination throughout the day or throughout a particular situation. And it can make it very challenging to figure out what's going on. But to your question about, how do we make inclusive workplaces, and I guess I will give a couple examples of the replacing competition with collaboration, and I'll do it from two different fields. One would be higher education and professors, right? I don't know how it works in Dickinson, but in the organizations I've worked in, the promotional process for faculty has been a competitive process. There's only so many spots, right? It's not just a matter of if you meet the criteria, it's that you are ranked, right? And that creates a very competitive environment. So I'm not going to help my fellow faculty member, because that might impede my ability to be promoted, right? So be thinking about how can we, make that a more, instead of a competitive thing, a more collaborative thing, and rewarding the collaboration and better rewarding what's called service work. Service work is it's akin to office housework, right? It tends to be devalued. Women tend to do it more. It does count often towards promotion, but it doesn't count as much as research and teaching, and depending on the institution. So making sure that the service work is equally valued to the other types of work. Another example, and this will be my final example, would be like the field of law, where there's often competition for the billable hours. And again, the office housework, it gets totally devalued, and the women have to spend time doing it because they're expected to do it, but that takes away time from the billable work. Well, why don't you make a rule that everybody has to do so much of the office housework, or sometimes the office housework can be, you can hire somebody explicitly to do that kind of work, like an administrative assistant. But if you can't do that, make sure that it's shared equally, and make sure that it's rewarded, so that that it's rewarded as much as the the billable work, so that there's not an incentive for men to get away with avoiding it, and women then being left to do it. So those are a couple examples. I hope that helps.
This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join us in the lobby for the book sale and signing after the talk. And please join me in thanking Jill Forrester and Amy Diehl.